The United Nations chief plans to visit Beijing for the Olympics. The decision comes amid a diplomatic boycott by the U.S. and some of its allies. Today is International Human Rights Day. Numerous abuses have been reported as commonplace inside China and under other regimes. But now people are standing up to offer a message of hope. Chinese authorities are blocking human rights supporters from leaving their homes. But it's nothing new and has been happening annually for years around Human Rights Day. A massive wave of unemployment is coming for China. That's a warning from a renowned professor. Chinese regulators removed some 100 apps from the country's app stores. They say the software bans result from collecting excessive personal information. That's as the regime ramps up its grip on user data. And a Central American nation turns away from Taiwan to embrace Beijing. But Taiwan's president says pressure from authoritarian countries proves the island is on the right path. Welcome to China in Focus. I'm Tiffany Meyer. We have some updates on the Beijing Winter Olympics. The head of the United Nations, Secretary General Antonio Guterres, will go to the Games. He accepted the invitation from the International Olympic Committee, or IOC. That's despite a diplomatic boycott by the U.S. and several of its allies. When it comes to the invitation, there is something to clear up. Olympic rules say world leaders and politicians are invited to the Games not by the host country, but by branches of the IOC in different countries. The Chinese regime also acknowledged this during its press conference on Thursday. But a couple weeks ago, Chinese state media seemed to suggest that China, not the IOC, decides who to invite. The Global Times wrote that China has not invited U.S. politicians to attend the Games and has no plans to invite a large number of foreign guests. This came after the U.S. and the U.K. said they were considering a diplomatic boycott. The message seems to be the boycott is pointless because I didn't invite you anyway. And Chinese state media also seems to omit something when they report on France's stance on the boycott. In a report on Friday, Guangxia News reported that French President Macron said France would not follow suit with the boycott, and that a diplomatic boycott of the Games is insignificant and merely symbolic. The article also mentioned that France's education and sports minister ruled out a boycott. Let's take a look at what Macron actually said on Thursday. He did question the usefulness of a diplomatic boycott, but he did not rule it out.
You must be clear. It's either you say you boycott and you don't send athletes, or you say you try to re-engage and try to make a useful action. As with all things on the international stage, I prefer to do things that have a useful effect.
And at the same time, France's foreign minister said France should coordinate with other European Union countries on this issue. The EU has not made a decision yet. So far, members of the Five Eyes Alliance have announced not to send officials to the Games. They are the US, Canada, the UK, Australia, and New Zealand. And two countries in Europe, Lithuania and Kosovo, have also declared a diplomatic boycott. All these countries are still sending their athletes. World Health Organization data shows that the Omicron variant has spread to over 50 countries. Beijing has reduced international flights to almost nothing compared to levels before the pandemic. Only 2% of them remain. And for the upcoming Beijing Winter Olympics in February, Chinese authorities decided to rely on chartered flights to bring athletes in. And the flights will only depart from cities such as Hong Kong, Singapore, Paris, and Tokyo. After the athletes and other attendees arrive in Beijing, they will enter a closed loop, strictly separated from other areas in China, and they will remain there for their entire stay. December 10th is International Human Rights Day. It's also a day to remember that actions speak louder than words. Please be aware, this report does include some descriptions of torture and images of abuse, but it does end with a message of hope.
The UN's famous document, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, holds the Guinness World Record for being the most translated document in the world. Yet for the victims of severe human rights abuse, words aren't enough.
I was beaten until I was dizzy, vomiting, and my ears were ringing. At the time, I had been married for only 8 months and I was pregnant.
In 2001, Li Huazhi was arrested for printing human rights advocacy materials and flyers that exposed the CCP's abuse of millions of Chinese citizens who practiced the peaceful Falun Gong spiritual movement. Then Chinese dictator Jiang Zemin vowed to crush the group in 1999. But millions of Chinese citizens refused and have been subjected to a massive nationwide persecution campaign that continues to this day.
During this persecution, I lost 4 of my family members within less than 100 days. My husband, my mother, father, and brother all passed away.
Li Hua's daughter, Xinjiang Xu, only spent time with her father twice before he died, but only when he was left in tragic condition, emaciated from torture and abuse under the regime's deadly policies.
The first time I saw my dad was when I was 7 years old. He wanted to hug me, but he was so skinny I didn't let him hold me because I was afraid he would be too exhausted. It was very scary.
While Li Hua and her family's experience may seem like an extreme example, under the CCP, these abuses in China are widespread and are just the tip of the iceberg. In June this year, the UN's human rights experts issued an alarm about forced live organ harvesting in China.
At the beginning, people didn't believe these crimes could really be happening. But now that the facts have been proven, people are finally taking action.
This Human Rights Day, Li Hua is signing a new pledge and telling her story to encourage Americans to also take the pledge.
In what appears to be a coordinated effort, Chinese authorities are prohibiting a number of human rights supporters from leaving their homes. Authorities were doing this on the eve of International Human Rights Day. In the early morning of December 9th, the wife of a human rights lawyer saw more than half a dozen men at her doorstep. They were blocking her door to prevent her from leaving her home. She was about to send her child to school, but now presumably both she and the child are confined. She yelled out at the men, saying they are violating her basic rights. The men told her that she was prohibited from leaving her home on December 9th and 10th. Besides the woman here, other rights supporters are experiencing this too. Human rights lawyer Wang Quanzhang and his wife were about to leave home to take their son to school when multiple unidentified individuals showed up at their door. They stopped the couple on their way and demanded that the couple let them take their son to school, presumably so that the couple then wouldn't have to leave their home. As expected, the mother rejected the demand.
你太搞笑了，你有毛病吧？你是谁呀你？你给我送，我把我孩子交给你，我都不认识你。你说我都不认识你，让我把孩子交给你，你觉得我放心？哎，我就问你，假如你的孩子，你说让他交给陌生人，你可以吗？你就是在。
What Chinese authorities are doing here is common practice. Every year on sensitive days, rights activists and supporters see their movements being restricted. One rights supporter told news outlet Radio Free Asia that this has been happening for more than 10 years. A London-based independent tribunal has come to a decision on China. It ruled that Beijing committed genocide against its Uyghur population and other ethnic minorities in its Xinjiang region. Here's more.
British barrister and international human rights lawyer Jeffrey Nice chaired the tribunal. Nice founded the independent UyghurTribunal in 2020 at the urging of activists. He announced the ruling on Thursday, saying Chinese leader Xi Jinping and other senior Chinese Communist Party officials bear primary responsibility for acts in Xinjiang. The judgment deems that crimes in Xinjiang are a direct result of politics, language, and speeches promoted by CCP leader Xi Jinping and others. It says the policies in question couldn't have happened in a country with such a rigid hierarchy, unless they had authority from the very top. The judgment follows a series of tribunal hearings in London this year where a panel of jurors reviewed evidence and testimony. Beijing labeled the tribunal political manipulation aimed at discrediting China and a pure anti-China force. Just one day after the ruling, the United Nations Human Rights Office is finalizing its assessment of the situation in China's Xinjiang region. The spokesperson for the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Rupert Colville, said the tribunal's deeply disturbing findings were still being analyzed.
We have, of course, similarly identified patterns of arbitrary detention and ill treatment in institutions, coercive labor practices, and an erosion of social and cultural rights in general.
And in the U.S., the House of Representatives passed a bill to block imports from Xinjiang this week, called the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act. The ban could influence goods from textiles to solar panel materials. It assumes that goods from Xinjiang would be made using forced labor, and so bans them from ports of entry into the U.S.
On top of that action, the U.S. is imposing sanctions on Chinese AI company SenseTime, as well as several officials in Xinjiang. The Treasury Department blacklisted SenseTime, preventing Americans from investing in it. The company has been preparing to list on the stock market in Hong Kong, with an estimated value of more than $700 million. The department says a SenseTime subsidiary has developed facial recognition programs to identify people based on their ethnicity, including Uyghurs. The sanctions now block 2 Xinjiang officials from using the U.S. financial system or getting U.S. visas. U.S. Senator Marco Rubio is calling on Airbnb to stop listing some rental properties in China's Xinjiang region, especially those owned by a paramilitary group involved in China's human rights abuses. In a letter to Airbnb CEO, Rubio says the company listed some properties on land owned by XPCC, a state-owned group involved with the ongoing genocide of Uyghurs and other ethnic and religious groups in China. He says by maintaining these listings, Airbnb is unwittingly enriching this organization. It also risks violating U.S. sanction law. The U.S. is hitting back against transnational corruption. The Virtual Summit for Democracy closed its first day agenda on Thursday. Government officials and private sector leaders from 110 countries attended the U.S.-led conference. In line with its mission, the State Department plans to set up a new role, coordinator on global anti-corruption issues. Likewise, the Treasury is unveiling a new kleptocracy fund to reward tips on corrupt foreign leaders who are hiding stolen money inside the United States. U.S. Secretary of State Blinken spoke about the issue. He said corruption in various forms has seen a significant ramp up and noted that democracies need to stand together against these dangerous trends because if they don't, no one will. Without naming names, Blinken also criticized Beijing and other authoritarian regimes for restricting freedom in the name of pandemic control. He stated that regimes have imposed harsh and unnecessary states of emergency and tried to postpone or cancel elections to consolidate their power. Hong Kong is an apparent example. Last year, Beijing postponed the city's Legislative Council general election for 1 year in the name of the pandemic. But many believe Beijing did so out of fear that the candidates it supported could lose. Blinken also warned against the misuse of surveillance technology, pointing out that the misuse of spyware to monitor citizens goes far beyond the needs to fight the virus. What's more, Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen also explained that her department is working hard to combat money laundering from overseas. Detailing the Treasury's Kleptocracy Assets Recovery Rewards program, she says the legislation calls for a $25 million cap per year on payments for tips that lead to seizure, forfeiture, or repatriation of stolen assets at U.S. financial institutions. The Virtual Democracy Summit will stretch over 2 days. China was not invited to attend. Turning to Central America, Nicaragua declares it's breaking ties with Taiwan. Instead, it's once again embracing diplomatically with Beijing. Taiwan responded to the move, saying no amount of pressure from authoritarianism will change Taiwan's democracy.
Nicaragua on Thursday broke its long-standing diplomatic ties with Taiwan. The next day, it swapped its allegiance over to Beijing instead.
Nicaragua's government states that it recognizes the existence of only one China. The People's Republic of China is the only legitimate government that represents all of China, and Taiwan is an inalienable part of the Chinese territory.
The break with Taiwan is also a blow to U.S. efforts and follows months of worsening relations between the Nicaraguan government of President Daniel Ortega and Washington. while Taipei says it was unbowed by Nicaragua's decision.
I want to tell our citizens that with the continued success of Taiwan's democracy, international support will only be stronger and we will only face greater pressure from the authoritarian camp. But we firmly believe that no matter if it's suppression through means of diplomacy or the threat of military force, none of these will ever change our determination to safeguard our diplomatic freedoms, our march towards the world, or our participation in the global community.
Nicaragua's move leaves Taiwan with just 14 formal diplomatic allies, most of them in Latin America and the Caribbean, plus a handful of small states. China and Nicaragua reestablished diplomatic ties on Friday. Beijing says it welcomes Nicaragua's decision.
An expert inside China is warning about a massive wave of unemployment in the country. The analysis by renowned Tsinghua University sociologist Professor Sun Liping recently went viral. Sun said in a video that a huge wave of unemployment is coming to China, and this wave mainly comes from 5 sources. The first is potential massive layoffs in the real estate sector. Real estate accounts for 28% of China's GDP and 26% of urban employment. The current wave of potential defaults among real estate firms may threaten some portion of that workforce. Real estate giant Evergrande alone directly employs about 200,000 people, while also providing work for nearly 4 million. It works with over 8,000 upstream and downstream cooperative enterprises. Evergrande's default may have an impact on the workforce of these companies as well. According to the Chinese professor, other factors causing the unemployment wave include foreign companies and investment leaving China. That says Chinese authorities pass a series of laws, such as the anti-sanctions law and the data security law, making it harder for foreign firms to operate in the country. Sun said other factors include shutdowns of small and medium-sized enterprises and layoffs from the private tutoring companies. The regime banned such private tutoring firms from making profits, raising capital, or going public. That has caused massive downsizing, and the 10 million teachers in this sector face the danger of losing their jobs anytime. Japanese outlet Nikkei Asia cited analysts estimating that a third of such jobs, or 3 million people, could be unemployed due to the crackdown. And lastly, risks in the cross-border e-commerce sector. Amazon this year kicked off an extensive cleanup campaign targeting consumer review abuses. It shut down 3,000 Chinese online stores for their fake reviews. This and more future campaigns could have an impact on Chinese store owners who rely on these platforms to make a living. But these 5 factors may not be all. Other sectors in China are also seeing large-scale downsizing. Due to the regime's crackdown on the entertainment industry, China's Nasdaq-listed online streaming giant iQIYI is cutting 40% to 50% of its workforce. That's according to Chinese media interviews with their employees. Other industry leaders are also reportedly downsizing. Tech companies Tencent, Kaishou, and TikTok's parent company ByteDance are laying off workers. The Hong Kong-listed short video giant Kuaishou has reportedly started to let go of workers who received low scores in performance reviews. The Chinese regime is taking new moves to crack down on the tech and cultural sectors. Chinese regulators on Thursday removed 106 apps from the country's app stores, saying the apps have collected excessive personal information. Current users can still use the apps, but new users aren't able to download them. The apps targeted include one of China's most popular social network platforms, Douban. Urban Chinese youngsters go there for book and movie reviews and other cultural discussions. News of the removal soon became one of the top trending topics on Chinese social media Weibo. Many were sad to see the app gone, and some say they don't understand the regime's move. Douban has already faced several hits from regulators this year. By November, the platform had been fined over $1 million for undisclosed reasons. Then last week, it was fined again for unlawful releases of information. The Chinese regime has ramped up regulation over online data. It passed a new law making it harder for foreign companies or investors to get information like supplies and financial statements. One expert told the Wall Street Journal that China has always been a big black box. But given the regime's recent actions, he says the black box becomes even blacker. Credit ratings company Fitch Ratings said on Thursday that China's Evergrande and another Chinese property developer Kaisa have defaulted on billions of dollars of debt. Evergrande is one of China's largest developers. It missed an interest payment last month, but had a 30-day grace period to make it. That month has passed. There's no word from Evergrande about the payment when Fitch reached out to it for an update. China's property market is massive and massively indebted. Last month, the U.S. Federal Reserve warned that trouble in the Chinese real estate market could impact the global economy. And trouble seems to be brewing, even if the Chinese central bank says it's contained. Leading developers like Fantasia, Modern Land, Cynic, and Kaisa have all defaulted in recent months. Property makes up about 30% of China's GDP, but home sales have fallen almost 25% in the 12 months through November. Now that Evergrande has officially defaulted, what's next for its global investors? The future is unclear at this point. In the U.S., creditors can force a company into some kind of restructuring and divide up the company's assets. But Evergrande is a Chinese company, and it's under the control of the Chinese Communist Party. And Beijing is stepping in. Some regime officials have joined a risk management committee, and they would help Evergrande restructure. And overseas investors might not be Beijing's priority. Chinese authorities have made it clear that they might need to consider Chinese creditors first. That includes home buyers, suppliers, and contractors who are waiting for Evergrande to pay them back. Evergrande said that it would actively engage with foreign creditors on a debt restructuring plan. Hong Kong authorities on Thursday convicted media tycoon and pro-democracy activist Jimmy Lai for his role in a candlelight vigil last year. The annual vigil in Hong Kong commemorates Beijing's crackdown on the Tiananmen protests in 1989. Hong Kong authorities did not authorize the vigil last year. Lai was the owner of one of the city's most popular pro-democracy newspapers, Apple Daily. Alongside with Lai, 2 other activists were also found guilty for either taking part in or inciting others to join the vigil. One of them is a lawyer, the other is a reporter. The 2 have supported pro-democracy movements in Hong Kong. The 3 will be sentenced at a later date. Hong Kong has held the world's largest annual Tiananmen vigils, but police rejected applications to hold the vigils both this year and last year. The ruling against the 3 is the latest blow to Hong Kong's democracy movement. Since Beijing imposed a sweeping national security law on the city last year, many activists have been arrested and jailed or have fled. The new law is widely considered a limit on the city's freedoms. British flagship aircraft carrier HMS Queen Elizabeth returned home today. She completed her first deployment in the Indo-Pacific region, exercising and participating with over 40 countries. One of the main goals is to counter the threats of the Chinese regime in the South China Sea and in the waters surrounding Taiwan. The UK's Royal Navy hails the operation as the most significant peacetime deployment in 25 years. The aircraft carrier led a force containing 9 ships, a submarine, and 5 air squadrons. About 4,000 personnel from the UK, the US, and the Netherlands manned the vessels. The carrier group covered 500,000 nautical miles during its mission to the Indo-Pacific. U.S. Marine Corps Brigadier General Simon Doran says the voyage was of great significance to the Western world.
I think just based upon the reception we got as we traveled all the way from the North Sea to the South China Sea and back from other nations coming out with interest, it just demonstrates the capability that this platform brings. It helps reassure our allies and partners while also deterring potential adversaries.
In the summer, UK Defense Secretary Ben Wallace said the carrier will go to whatever places international law allows. He said Britain had a duty to demonstrate the freedom of navigation. The carrier sailed through the South China Sea all the way to Japan. Beijing claims most of the South China Sea, but an international tribunal has declined its claim. And that's all for today's China in Focus. Thanks for watching, and see you tomorrow.